So lately, I've been doing a lot of sitting with the intersection between nervous system healing and our walk with God. And since my last video, I was asked to kind of talk more about this topic. So I really wanted to hit on the fact that God does not override the nervous system that He designs. He uses the nervous system that He designed. And I figured this is a really good place to start because this is where a lot of confusion comes in when it comes to whether or not we should listen to science or listen to faith, because we're missing the fact that the two can work together very well. I can remember a season where my body was clearly asking for rest, and I thought that the most spiritual thing to do was to pray harder and ask God for supernatural strength. And listen, God can give supernatural strength. I truly believe that with my whole heart. But what I've also learned is that sometimes that supernatural strength, it doesn't bypass the body, it flows through it. And sometimes the strength that God gives is permission to rest in a way that the body finally feels safe again. I had to learn that praying your way out of a nervous system that actually needs safety is not a display of faith. It's often just survival dressed up as spirituality. And I also want to address something important because scripture talks a lot about denying and crucifying the flesh. And it's super easy to hear things like this and think, well, we're not supposed to listen to our bodies, but that's not true. And the more I sit with that, the more I realize that the flesh that scripture calls us to deny is not the same as the body that God calls us to steward. And the clearest way that I can say this is that denying your flesh is truly just denying those impulses that pull us away from God. It's not about denying your humanity. It's about denying those impulses that pull you into fear, control, or self-reliance. Rest doesn't pull me away from God. Regulation doesn't pull me away from God. And safety doesn't pull me away from God. But pride does, and fear-driven urgency does, and overriding my limits does. Psychology just gave me language for what scripture was already inviting me into, which is stillness, rest, safety, and trust. A dysregulated nervous system can create impulses that feel spiritual but are not aligned. For example, feeling like you have to act right now or you'll miss God. That pressure to feel like you got to do it now, don't rest, don't wait, can feel like obedience, but it's often just a nervous system that doesn't feel safe slowing down. God's leading is clear and steady. Anxiety-driven impulse is urgent and pressured. And yes, God can move quickly, but He is not frantic. Another example is pushing through exhaustion because you believe resting means you lack faith, which to some can sound spiritual because you're sacrificing or dying to yourself, but sometimes it's just a body in survival mode that hasn't been given permission to rest. And leaving this unchecked can have serious health consequences. And next is hypervigilance mistaken for discernment. Sometimes being constantly on alert, reading between people's tone, on high alert, and assuming hidden motives gets labeled as discernment. But oftentimes, that's not discernment. That's just a nervous system trained to anticipate a threat. Discernment brings clarity, but hypervigilance brings suspicion. And this is why nervous system regulation is so important in our faith walk. Not because we're being led by our bodies, but because clarity lives in the calm. There's a reason why scripture says, be still and know. Because stillness comes before the knowing. Even Elijah, who was tired and in the wilderness, needed sleep and food before he moved forward on what God spoke to him in. And it shows a great example of how God tends to the body before He gives direction. So now when I have an impulse, I ask a simple question. Does this pull me closer to God or does this pull me closer to fear? If it pulls me into peace, clarity, and trust, I pay attention. And if it pulls me into chaos, compulsion, or urgency, that's when I pause. And that's not being flesh-led, that's being discerning. Dying to yourself does not mean living unsafe. And obedience does not require you to abandon the body that God designed. So if your body is asking for rest, that does not mean you are failing spiritually. It just might mean that God is inviting you into a safer way of trusting Him. And that's what I'm learning, and I'm grateful to be learning it slowly, without unnecessary pressure and without unnecessary fear. Because not stewarding our faith walk and our bodies properly impacts our health. And if you want me to dive more into what that looks like, let me know in the comment section below.